Before we begin, ask yourself this. What happens when a most powerful man in the world loses his mind? What happens when a god walks among men, demanding blood, pleasure, and absolute control? If these questions intrigue you, if you crave the shadows of history, the horrors you were never taught in school, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel, where the dead still whisper and history bleeds. Now, let us descend into the madness. This is the story of Caligula, Rome's golden heir, Rome's darkest nightmare. Music swells slightly, a low haunting string beneath breath. They called him Little Boots, Caligula, a name born in the laughter of legions. A boy mascot, dressed in miniature armor, marching beside his father, the beloved Germanicus. The soldiers adored him. Rome admired him. And when fate stole his father and poisoned his family, the boy was taken to the belly of power, the palace. But inside that gilded cage, something twisted. Something broke. The boy who once laughed with soldiers learned the language of fear, betrayal, and survival. He watched his mother starve. He watched his brothers executed. He learned that in Rome, power was never inherited. It was hunted, stolen, drenched in blood. By the time Caligula became emperor in 37 AD, he had already lost everything except his smile. And that smile, Rome would come to fear. Sound, slow heartbeat rhythm under light strings. At first, his rule seemed like a miracle. Tiberius, the cold, paranoid old emperor, was gone. Rome exhaled. The Senate celebrated. The people wept with joy. Caligula gave bonuses to soldiers, pardoned exiles through lavish games, and fed the hungry. For a moment, Rome danced. But the honeymoon ended with a fever. Only months into his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill. Some say poison. Others say divine punishment. He vanished from the public eye, trembling between life and death. And when he returned, he was not the same. The man who emerged from that sickness was not a ruler. He was a god, at least in his own mind. He demanded worship. Temples, statues carved with his face. He dressed as Mercury, then Apollo, then Venus. He had the heads removed from ancient gods and replaced them with his own. He walked barefoot through the halls of power, cloaked in silk and arrogance, claiming divine blood. And Rome obeyed, because to disobey was to die. Faint sound of chains dragging, a knife being slowly unsheathed. The executions began quietly. A whisper here, an accusation there, a senator who hesitated, a noble who didn't clap loud enough. Gone. Heads rolled in silence, then in screams. Caligula didn't just punish disloyalty, he performed it. He reveled in the spectacle. He mocked his victims as they died. Sometimes he would invite nobles to dinner, feed them exotic delicacies, and then casually mention how they might be executed the next day. For sport, for amusement, because gods don't need reasons. Low hum of distant crowd, rising into chaos and cutting away suddenly. Then came the orgies. Not rumors, not whispers, but palace-wide decadence turned into ritual. He transformed his palace into a temple of desire. Senators' wives, their daughters, even their sons, were summoned at his will. Resistance was met with ruin. Caligula didn't seek pleasure. He sought domination. He wanted to own every body, every breath, every ounce of dignity the Roman elite possessed. And he did, with gold, with fear, with divine decree. He even claimed to have turned his palace into a brothel, where noble women were forced to serve while their husbands watched, paralyzed by terror. But his cruelty wasn't confined to the rich. He turned on the people too. He'd scatter coins from balconies just to watch mobs trample each other to death. He once executed a man simply because he was handsome, and Caligula grew jealous of the attention. Another time, he fed prisoners to wild beasts because the arena's lion stock was low and he didn't want the crowd to get bored. He wasn't merely cruel. He was theatrical. Everything had to be seen, heard, remembered, because madness loves applause. Beat. Low strings taper off into soft silence. Just breath. But Caligula didn't act alone. He had enablers, cowards in purple robes, generals and priests who bowed low, kissed his feet, and whispered prayers to their living god while choking on the scent of rotting flesh. They watched as he declared his horse, Incitatus, a priest, and then a senator. They nodded as he built golden stables and marble fountains for it. They clapped when he threatened to make the horse consul. And why? Because they were afraid. Because power doesn't just corrupt. It consumes. And Rome? Rome bled. The treasury drained. The laws dissolved. The gods defiled. Temples once sacred became theaters of blasphemy. Citizens no longer prayed for salvation. They prayed simply to survive. Because in Caligula's Rome, fear was law, lust was currency, and cruelty was divine. Soft wind builds behind the final lines. Torch flicker returns. But this is only the beginning. The descent continues. And what comes next is worse. Caligula had become more than a man. He was a storm cloaked in silk and blood, crowned not by laurel, but by screams. And yet no one dared stop him. Because when a god sits on a throne, mortals forget how to resist. But behind the marble walls of the palace, Rome's soul was rotting. And the rot had a scent, perfumed and perfidious. Whispers spread through the alleys of Rome. Whispers that Caligula was not just cruel, but insane. That he spoke to the moon. That he believed Neptune, the god of the sea, had insulted him. One day, he marched his legions to the shore of the English Channel, declaring war on Poseidon himself. Instead of launching ships, he ordered his soldiers to stab the ocean. They whipped the waves. And then he commanded them to collect seashells as trophies of victory. These shells, he declared, will be paraded through the city as spoils of war. Short pause. Wind brushes through silence like breath over skin. Rome did not laugh. Rome did not cry. Rome stood still and obeyed. Because by now, to question Caligula was to vanish. To speak his name without reverence was to disappear. The prisons overflowed with nobility. Torture became a ceremony. Trials were replaced by execution lists. And those who once held power now held fear like a dagger at their throats. Faint clang of chains tightening. Music darkened slightly. Caligula's palace was no longer a residence. It was a theater of horror. He would appear unannounced in the Senate chambers, draped in glittering robes, demanding that laws be rewritten in his honor. He forced senators to grovel before him, not as emperor, but as a god. Sometimes, he ordered their families to be arrested mid-speech, just to see them break. He once told a senator, "Off with his head, and bring me his wife." And they did. The screams were not heard, because the Senate had learned to smile through tears. Soft heartbeat rhythm begins, slow, anxious. But madness, once unleashed, never stops growing. Soon, it wasn't enough for Caligula to dominate Rome. He wanted to rewrite reality itself. He ordered bridges to nowhere, spanning miles across the Bay of Baiae, built only so he could ride his horse across them in divine demonstration. Thousands of slaves died, laying stone beneath the sea. But the bridge was completed, and Caligula rode across it in golden armor, laughing like Apollo reborn. The gods above watched silently, perhaps even in horror. Meanwhile, famine swept parts of the empire. Rome bled coin to fund Caligula's dreams. Taxes became torture. Debts were paid in flesh. Noble families were accused of treason simply to seize their estates. He even sold seats at his own dinner table at obscene prices. Not for food, but for the privilege of watching a god eat. And in those Caligula halls, filled with pearls and terror, people smiled while choking on fear. Music softens, just the sound of torchlight burning low. But beneath the madness, a darker cruelty simmered. Caligula didn't merely destroy men. He hunted innocents. There were rumors, quiet and terrible, that he took children into his chambers and returned them broken. Some say he bragged about opening a newborn from the belly of its mother, just to see its face. Others say he took sisters and brothers, made them watch, then destroyed them both. Rome had known tyrants before, but never this. Never one who drank pleasure from agony, who saw suffering as scripture, who believed himself divine and untouchable. Pause. Beat of silence. Then a whisper. But God can bleed, and even monsters can be feared by their own shadows. Because something was shifting. In the Senate, among the Praetorian Guard, in the silence of the palace halls. Eyes were watching, hands were trembling, and behind closed doors, a single word began to take shape. Enough. It began not with daggers, but with nods. Small agreements. Secret meetings. The guard, his own elite protectors, grew restless. Once bribed with gold, They now starved for stability. The Senate, humiliated, dreamed of vengeance. And in the hearts of the people, once devoted, something darker bloomed. Not revolution, not rebellion, but hope. Hope that the screaming would stop, that the gods would fall. Sound, a soft knife sharpening slowly. Then silence. But Caligula didn't see it. Or worse, he didn't care. He strutted through his maze of mirrors, believing himself immortal. He mocked Jupiter. He kissed his sister in public. He wore women's clothes and crowned himself goddess of the moon. He made generals crawl at his feet and ordered the stars to obey him. And every breath he took drew the dagger closer. Final moments fade to cold wind. No music, just stillness. The madness had peaked, but the fall had yet to begin. And when it did, it would be swift and bloody and unforgettable. January 41 AD. The marble corridors of the Palatine Hill were silent, save for the occasional rustle of robes or the whisper of plotting men. Something was in the air, thicker than incense, sharper than wine. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation, because even gods can be assassinated. Caligula had grown careless. He believed his own mythology, believed the world would break before him, that his name would echo forever, not as emperor, but as deity. He surrounded himself with yes-men, sycophants, actors who applauded his cruelty like theater. But the curtain was about to fall, and behind it stood Cassius Chaerea, a man humiliated, a soldier mocked, faint sound of sword being drawn. Wind shifts, like breath caught in a throat. Cassius Chaerea was a commander in the Praetorian Guard, once a proud man, reduced to mockery. Caligula had humiliated him publicly, repeatedly, given him womanly passwords for battle drills, laughed at his voice, called him soft, broken him. But Chaerea had learned a lesson from Caligula himself. When you're humiliated long enough, you stop fearing death. And so, he began to plan, not in darkness, but in silence. He spoke to others, quietly, cautiously, to senators, to guards, to palace officials, all of them worn thin by the terror, the shame, the madness. He asked them one question: "Is this Rome?" And to each man, the answer burned in their chest: "No, not anymore." Soundscape, slow, steady build of tension. Distant heartbeat begins, one slow thump every few seconds. The plan was simple: a festival, a distraction, a confined hallway, steel beneath the robes. On the morning of the 24th of January, Caligula rose, as usual, draped in gold, surrounded by cowards, smiling with the arrogance of a man who believed himself eternal. He watched the actors perform, laughed at their lines, insulted their efforts, and then he left the theater, through the private passageway, into history. Chaerea and his men were waiting. They surrounded him in silence. At first, Caligula sneered, laughed, mocked, until the first blade struck, and then the second, and then the third. He didn't scream. He gasped, like a god choking on mortality. Sound of a blade plunging into flesh, muffled and final. His blood sprayed the marble. He collapsed, not with dignity, but with disbelief. And as the life drained from his body, so too did the fear from Rome. He died beneath the palace he had turned into a tomb. And in that moment, Caligula, emperor, god, monster, was gone. But the horror wasn't, because his legacy remained. In the broken Senate, in the shattered noble families, in the guards who had murdered and raped in his name, and in the people who had watched it all in silence. Music softens. A cold, reflective tone settles in. They tried to erase him. The Senate ordered all his statues destroyed, his inscriptions removed, his name scratched from stone and scroll. But memory clings, like blood on marble. The people remembered. The laughter turned to nervous mutters. The applause became guilt. And whispers of the orgies, the executions, the madness never truly faded. Brief silence. Then, and what of his body? Some say it was left to rot where he fell. Others claim his German guards carried him away, burying him in secret beneath the moonlight. A tomb unmarked, a death denied glory. His wife and daughter, both executed the same day. Their blood silenced the bloodline, as if the gods themselves were cleansing the empire. But can you erase madness? Can you truly kill a god, once he's lived inside men's hearts? Music grows uneasy, strings trembling slightly. Rome tried to forget. But how do you forget an emperor who called himself a god and demanded your soul? How do you cleanse streets that had seen so much blood? Caligula was gone, but the scar he left behind was deep and permanent, and the question remains, was he truly mad? Or was Rome simply looking in the mirror and hating what it saw? Because Caligula wasn't born in darkness. He was made in it, raised in a palace of fear, forged by betrayal, taught that love is weakness and mercy is suicide. He became what Rome demanded, a god with no gods above him. And when he gave them horror, they applauded. Until they didn't. Music fades to a single low tone, barely audible, a heartbeat, one last breath. And so he died, not in battle, not in old age, but in a hallway, stabbed by those who once called him divine, killed not for what he did, but for what he revealed. When Caligula fell, the empire didn't cheer. Not truly, because Rome had seen the mask pulled from its face, and what lay beneath wasn't Caligula alone. It was Rome itself. His death did not erase the past. It only lit it brighter, like a pyre in the dark. And as his blood dried on the marble floors, the empire began to ask, what now? The Senate, ever desperate to reclaim its dignity, saw an opportunity. Without an emperor, perhaps the republic could be restored. Perhaps, finally, Rome could rise from its knees. But power, once tasted, doesn't vanish. And in the shadow of Caligula's fall, a new figure stepped forward, shaking, stammering, unsure. His name was Claudius. Sound, soft shuffle of sandals across polished stone. He was Caligula's uncle, thought by many to be a fool, weak, stuttering, mocked by the court for his limp and nervous tics. But in the chaos after the assassination, while soldiers stormed and senators schemed, Claudius was found hiding behind a curtain, shivering, pale, and alive. The Praetorian Guard saw him, and instead of killing him, they bowed. Claudius was crowned emperor not by the Senate, not by the people, but by the very same guard that had murdered Caligula. The same blades that had ended the god's madness now protected his heir. And the irony? It was perfect. Music becomes colder, more cerebral. The sound of ink on parchment, distant voices in Latin. Claudius would prove far more competent than anyone expected. He brought stability, order. He built aqueducts, conquered Britain, and restored the empire's confidence. But the shadow of Caligula never left him. Not really, because the terror wasn't just political, it was personal. The nobility remembered the feasts of humiliation. The people remembered the starving winters while orgies roared behind palace walls. And the empire, still fragile, knew that under the right circumstances, the madness could return. That the line between ruler and god had been crossed once, and could be crossed again. Whispered voice, layered. What if it never left? But history isn't made by sanity. It's made by spectacle. And Caligula, though dead, remained unforgettable. His name was erased from official records. But stories cannot be erased. The music shifts, subtly theatrical, as if on a stage being lit. In the years that followed, Roman playwrights began whispering echoes of him into their characters. Writers painted him as both villain and victim. Philosophers debated whether he had been possessed, poisoned, or punished by the gods. Some believed he was cursed, marked by the blood of his murdered family, twisted by childhood trauma, raised in the shadows of Tiberius's perversion. Others saw him as a mirror, a reflection of Rome's own descent into excess, cruelty, and blind ambition. Beat. The music fades. A slow breath is heard. But one thing is certain. Caligula's legacy was never about governance. It was about power unrestrained, about what happens when fear replaces reason, when applause silences morality, and when a man begins to believe that suffering is sacred. His statues may be dust now, his palaces buried beneath centuries of stone and silence. But his story has survived, because every empire, every generation, has its own Caligula. Sound, distant crack of thunder. A faint scream, barely audible, like something ancient echoing from the deep. Even today, we tell his tale, not to remember him, but to warn ourselves. Because madness, when dressed in gold and crowned with worship, is not just tolerated. It's worshipped, until it isn't. And by then, it's too late. Final moment of silence. The crowd cheers. The knives glint. The god falls. And the city keeps breathing. He called himself a god. He claimed the heavens bent to his will. He tore the veil from Rome's dignity and showed the world what power looks like when stripped of mercy, humanity, and soul. He was Caligula, and even in death, he refused to be forgotten. Faint echo of a heartbeat, slow and heavy. One beat every few seconds. We remember him not because he ruled wisely, not because he built, not because he led, but because he revealed something we try so desperately to ignore. That civilization is a costume, and underneath, the beast waits. Caligula was not a glitch in Rome's story. He was its reflection, its mask cracked open, its desire for power, pleasure, and pain, all spoken aloud without shame. Music rises slowly, somber strings layered with low, ambient drones. He took what Rome valued most, honor, law, virtue, and turned it into performance. He mocked the gods. He defiled the innocent. He humiliated the powerful. And still they obeyed. Because that is the true terror. Not that one man could be so mad, but that an entire empire let him. Beat. The music fades to a low rumble, deep and resonant. In the end, Caligula died the same way he ruled, without restraint. His murder was not justice. It was fear catching up, a god falling not from the heavens, but from his own illusion. And Rome? Rome wiped the blood off the floor and kept marching. Because empires don't cry. They adapt. They evolve. They survive. And sometimes they forget. Whispers fade in, overlapping voices saying Caligula in multiple tones. But not this time. Because we do remember. His story echoes through history, whispered in the corridors of tyranny, wrapped in the silk of excess. A reminder, a warning, a shadow that stretches far beyond the Palatine Hill. And if you've made it this far, then you already feel it. The pull of the dark, the truth behind the myth, the slow realization that this grotesque chapter was real. It happened to real people, in real halls, under a real sky. And that's why we tell it. Because forgetting is how it happens again. Final breath. Music builds slowly for one last rise. Here at Dark Hours Archive, we bring these stories into the light. Not to shock, not to glorify, but to remember, and to understand just how thin the line is between ruler and tyrant, between man and monster. If you found this story compelling, if you want to explore more hidden truths, buried crimes, and haunted history, then subscribe to the channel. We release new deep dive dark history videos every week. Stories you were never meant to hear, truths they hoped you'd forget, and voices that still echo in the silence. Sound, a soft metallic clink like a crown falling to stone. Because here, history doesn't sleep. It waits.